I'm going to copy some of the things Bob just said. You're also invited to close your eyes during the sermon if that helps you to... you can even fall asleep, but just please don't snore. And also, we do need to hear stories again, so I'm going to do a little paraphrasing of our story again to start off our sermon. But before that, I find it important in a healing story to give maybe a little bit of a disclaimer. Because I've lived and experienced how stories like this can be used, sort of weaponized as a way to make people feel bad about themselves, that they haven't been healed from something. And I think it's important to not do that. There's a famous person, he was called Paul, he used to be called Saul, who mentioned that he prayed at least 3 times for himself to be healed from something, and was not. Paul isn't someone we generally think of as being someone who has a lack of faith. So I just wanted to throw that disclaimer out in a healing story, because a faithful person like Paul was unable to be healed from his maladies. Okay, now that I got that out of the way, our passage today, I think, is an awesome one. There's just so much going on. It is so interesting. And we start off in Syria, what is now Syria, what it was then Aram. And it's partially about a powerful and ancient leader of the Aram army. He had some acclaim for having led the country to many victories. And for good or ill, some of those were against Israel. Note the fact that General Naaman had a servant who had been captured in a battle with Israel. This general, Naaman, is, for that and other accomplishments, held in high favor by his king. In most aspects of his life, things were great. He was in a high position of power and authority, put there by his king. He was successful at his job. But he had gotten leprosy, or a skin disease of some kind, and he was considered unclean. He probably would have been unable to go to worship corporately. He could have been quarantined, and therefore would have been unable to do his job as a general. That is a serious issue. Not just physically, but socially, psychologically, vocationally. We know from the New Testament accounts that lepers would often be cast outside the city, so they couldn't spread the disease in town. Whew. Naaman himself is not recorded as ever having complained publicly about this leprosy, but I think we can imagine how difficult that would be, how it would completely upend our lives. Separation, disease. Naaman has not complained that we know of about this leprosy, but it turns out that the servant, the slave that he has, talks about it with his wife, who then brings it up with Naaman. The servant, by the way, is never named though she is the key to this whole adventure. It is the servant who feels sorry for him and comes up with a suggestion that there is a healer in Israel, in Samaria, who is very good with these kinds of things. Once he hears the idea, he's convinced. He takes it up with his own king, who says, go for it. I mean, after all, he wants his top general to be healed and ready to go, to function well. The king, in fact, writes a letter of introduction to the king of Israel. It's interesting to note that the king didn't say, go to the prophet who can heal you. He says, go to the king, which I always found strange. Perhaps that's part of being a world leader. You communicate with those who you view as your equals. And kings, perhaps, I'm guessing. Perhaps he thought, well, if I had a healer in my land, he would be under my thumb and control and be doing my will. World leaders can think that way, can't they? To view their people as their possession and theirs to control and use. It's not so different today, I don't believe. When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent you my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy. That you. Again, I'm not sure why he sent us to the king of Israel, the servant from Israel, the slave that they had captured, didn't say the king could heal, but that there is a prophet who can do this. The king sends Naaman off with gifts reserved for a state visit between royalty, gold, silver, and naturally 10 changes of clothing. The last item always puzzled me. I should maybe do a little more research, that it's probably a more common thing than I would think of. I like to imagine maybe he got word that the king of Samaria was a real crummy dresser and thought he ought to spruce up the neighborhood. Naaman launches off on his journey with horses, chariots, gold, silver, and clothing, and he goes to the king. Just before he gets there, he sends his letter of introduction from his king to the Samaritan king. And instead of reading it as a friendly request, the Samaritan king screams, and wouldn't you know it, starts tearing away at his clothes. It's a good thing Naaman has been sent with new clothing. I just find that so funny that as he is coming with clothes, he rips his clothing, which is a sign of grief, of mourning, tears at his clothes. He's furious and scared because he reads this request not for what it is, but he jumps to conclusions. He thinks it's a trick. He thinks that he's sending his most prized general, who has already apparently won some victories with Israel in the past. He has a slave that was taken from a previous battle. And he thinks this is an impossible request. It's just an excuse to get into our territory and cause trouble. He says, am I God to give death or life? That this man sends word to me to cure a man of leprosy? Just look and see how he's trying to pick a quarrel with me. He demonstrates a good instinct and a bad instinct. A good instinct was correct. I'm not God. He's not God. I'm not God either. Correct, he's not God. He doesn't have the power to give life or death. But the bad instinct was that this must mean war. The warrior, the king of Arim, and the king of Samaria represent in the world power and knowledge. But here we see that their power and knowledge is lacking. They cannot heal. They don't even know who can do such a thing. But who does know? A nameless slave. So as this is going on, somewhere along here, the word gets down to Elisha, that the general had come looking for a prophet who could heal him of his skin disease. So he sent word to the king saying, "What are you doing sitting in there tearing at your clothes?" I just love the sense of humor, at least that I receive in these passages. Send the guy to me, and I'll teach him a thing or two about there still being prophets in Israel. So Naaman bundles up his trunk of clothes and gold and goes on to see Elisha and sends out a servant to knock on the door. If Elisha lives out in the country, it's one thing, but imagine if he lived right in town and suddenly this general shows up with dozens of horses and chariots and servants carrying huge trunks of gold and silver and tasteful ties and sport jackets. It would be quite the sight. Elisha's home, but instead of coming out to greet the general, he sends out one of his messengers with that message that he should go wash himself 7 times in the river Jordan, and then, well, that's it. The end. Healed. Just go wash up in that muddy river, and that's it. And the general is furious. And why not? He came all this way expecting it to be a state visit. With all of his entourage in back of him, these fabulously expensive gifts to pay off the healer. And all Elisha says is, go take a bath. I thought for me, because I am this amazing, successful general, for me, he would do something different. He should come out and at least say a few prayers and wave his hands over me or something. Then comes the best. One of his aides stops and says some wise words. Listen up. If the prophet had given you a hard task, you would have done it. Why not do it when it's something easy? If it were a difficult and complicated thing worthy of how I view myself, I would have done it. But this is too simple for me. So that's our third hearing of our story today, which is half my sermon. There are lots of things going on in this passage. I have never had a chronic illness, and I can't imagine the psychological work that has to take a toll on a person who is dealing with a continued disease. I think what a lot going on here is as much psychological and spiritual as it is physical. It's not necessarily the healing itself. It's the who and the how and the where and the why. Naaman's life is on edge. He can no longer be the rich and powerful and feared general if he can't work, and he can't work if he has this disease. If the word gets out, he may be quarantined. He may be banished from the kingdom. He's a loyal and successful general, so maybe that's not likely. But it certainly would have a high impact on his and his family's life. He was also a very proud person. And in reading this passage several times this week, I'm reminded of a story of Wilt the Stilt Chamberlain. I mean, that's before my time, so hopefully it's not before some people's times, but I think Wilt Chamberlain is pretty well known as a great basketball player. And the story about Wilt was that he was a great player. He could do everything except for one thing, and that was make free throws. They're free, but he couldn't take advantage of them. Maybe you've heard this story. He was terrible shooting at free throws. I looked at a clip. It was hard to find, but I found a clip, and he just had a very awkward sort of how he shot was very awkward and weird. And someone came up to him. He's only making like 50% or less of his free throws, which is not good. Someone came up to him and said, "Why don't you try the underhand?" I don't move around much in a sermon, but I think we all know the underhand free throw. So he tried it, and he made them, and made them, and made them. He tried it for 3 games, and I should have wrote down the stats. He was 33 for 39, which is a little better than 18 for 39. A lot better. Overnight, he could do something he couldn't do. But something else happened. He got made fun of. The crowds would make fun of him. The opposing team would make fun of him. His own teammates would make fun of him. Even though he was able to do this, it made him feel foolish. So he stopped. He did it for 3 days and it worked, but he stopped because of what was perceived as foolish by other people. Our general thought this was foolish and wasn't going to do it. Doesn't he know who I am? Come out here and put on a show. I brought gold and silver and clothing. This is beneath me. Naaman, I think part of what God does is humanize us, to maybe put aside some of those things we have in our head as important, as right, as things that are worthy. Another thing going on here is that sometimes the biggest change does not take place with the biggest miracle. He really wanted to be healed. He thought that his disease was the most important disease going around, and he really thought there should be more to it. Again, I thought he would come out and wave his hand over the spot and cure the leprosy. But no, he says to go bathe 7 times in the Jordan River. Aren't the rivers at home better than these waters? We've got rivers. Does he think that I haven't bathed since I've received this disease? Of course I have. Naaman, the commander of the army in the country of Arim, bordering to the northeast of Israel. Today belongs to Syria. Then, like today, Damascus is served as its capital. Then, like today, the two countries are involved in wars. And Naaman is a strong leader of a strong nation, a great man and highly regarded. Yet we see a surprising contrast. The biblical writer points out that the army chief from this country had arrived at his success because the Lord, Israel's God, had given him victory. But the more dramatic contrast is being revealed. The valiant warrior, who in the Hebrew text is literally lifted of face, is startlingly given another description, leper. The word is jarring. The man whose face was lifted up with respect is bowed with shame. The stigma of leprosy was strong in biblical times. To have this malady was to be disgraced, and for many to be an outcast. The man whose name meant pleasant had become ugly. And another contrast pours out of this story. The raiding party had entered Israel long before our story and come back with a prize, a young maiden, a girl, was given to Naaman's wife as a servant or slave. But this girl is far from helpless and powerless. She serves a God who is strong enough to allow Naaman to win battles and is strong enough to erase the dishonor that the honorable Naaman wore on his face. This girl gives a would-be command to a great commander. Go to the man of God in Israel. He will make you whole. The faith of the simple servant girl. A faith so innocent and so bold that stops the army commander in his tracks. Naaman, with his options few, says, I've got nothing to lose but to heed these words. Could her promise of healing be based in truth? What did he have to lose but the curse that he wore every day? He goes to the king, and the king writes a letter to Israel's king. The letter asks Israel's king to tend to the matter. It comes with leprosy reversement payment. And the two kings sort of provide comical relief in a gripping story. They are cut from the same cloth. One thinks he can buy the miracle of healing, and the other is engrossed in his own self-preservation, that he sees this as a pretense for war. Neither of them understand the dynamics that the slave girl understands, and that Naaman understands at the end. The heroes of the story, the servant girl and Elisha. The man, almost larger than life, Elisha, the man of God, while his own king worries about his own behind, Elisha carries with him the word and power of the Almighty God. These petty kings know nothing of true authority, but Elisha does. He served well under Elijah, the great prophet of Israel. And Elisha received a double portion of Elijah's prophetic influence, and would go on to prove through word and deed that there is one who is worthy of honor. That is Yahweh, the God of Israel. With a word, he ends his king's anxiety and takes on himself the situation of the foreigner, Naaman. the worried king and the calm prophet. Elisha tells Naaman what to do. Elisha offers a healing, yes, but the real healing was the relationship with God. Introduced him to God. Introduced him to Yahweh. Introduced him to the one who actually had true power and authority. And for Naaman, he had to humble himself, to come to terms with who he was and compared to with who God is. For me, he could come out and put on a show. But so it is with the God of Israel, our God, Yahweh. Story is a reminder to me to put aside my own pretenses, to put aside my own ideas of position, of power, of authority, and to humble myself. May we humble ourselves when we come before the Lord our God. Amen.